Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. The pressure is immediate. The structure is exposed. The historical puzzle is not just who prevailed, but why did some institutions keep functioning effectively long after their founder was gone, while others fell apart almost immediately? At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying, because an institution's ability to outlast its founder may depend on whether authority and practice were embedded in roles, records, and trained personnel. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate. The structure is exposed. Why did some institutions keep functioning effectively long after their founder was gone, while others fell apart almost immediately? That is the tension the institution has to absorb before uncertainty becomes political opportunity. The problem begins when founders often solve problems through personal authority, memory, and relationships in ways that can hide how little the institution itself understands without them. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The distinction is between charisma-centered authority and role-based authority that other people can inhabit without recreating the founder's personality. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. When that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. The structure feels fragile. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is institutional memory and continuity theory, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. Institutional memory and continuity theory, how codified practice, trained successors, durable record-keeping, shared routines, and role-based authority allow a system to persist beyond its founder. The distinction matters here. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis then is hard to build in practice. An institution's ability to outlast its founder may depend on whether authority and practice were embedded in roles, records, and trained personnel. Start with the hidden strength of durable institutions. They remember through structures, not only through personalities. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A founder begins by improvising. Improvisation is often necessary early, but it becomes dangerous if it never gets translated into shared practice. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Codified procedure matters because it externalizes memory. It allows people to act without waiting for the founder's personal recall every time. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Training matters because roles must be learned socially, not merely named. A title without transmitted practice remains an empty shell. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Durable records matter for the same reason. They preserve sequence, precedent, and expectation beyond one person's private judgment. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. Role clarity is another mechanism. People need to know not only what the founder used to decide, but who now has the standing to decide in the founder's absence. Shared routine lowers panic because repetition gives successors something recognizable to continue even while authority is emotionally unsettled. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. This is why institutions with strong memory can survive leaders who are less magnetic than the founder. They no longer need charisma to explain every move. That is the mechanism. The opposite pattern appears when every important decision route passes through one person. In that case, departure reveals not just grief, but functional amnesia. That is the mechanism. Founder dependence often looks efficient while the founder is present because centralization compresses disagreement and shortens decision time. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. Yet that same efficiency can conceal brittleness. Others stop practicing judgment, coordination, and boundary setting because the founder always finishes the work for them. That is the mechanism. A durable institution, therefore, has to distribute not only tasks but also interpretive capacity, so people can keep applying the mission when novelty appears. That is the mechanism. Memory is not just written storage. It is embodied in trained personnel, recurring meetings, shared standards, and credible handoff between offices. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Continuity grows stronger when people trust that the role still carries authority even if the current office holder lacks the founder's aura. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. So the strategic question is whether the founder built a machine that remembers, trains, and authorizes beyond personal proximity or merely a circle organized around continued access to the founder. A reasonable counterpoint is that some founder-centered systems survive for a time simply because the successor is strong enough to recreate centrality through their own skill. The limits still matter. The limitation is that institutions differ widely, and the right degree of codification or continuity can vary between courts, armies, religious bodies, and administrative offices. The limits still matter. Continuity mechanisms can still fail when procedure becomes too rigid, causing successors to preserve forms faithfully while losing the adaptive judgment that once made the institution effective. The limits still matter. There is also a bounded exception in crisis periods, when strong temporary centralization after the founder may stabilize the institution long enough for memory to be rebuilt later. Institutional continuity is not automatically virtuous. A durable system can preserve unjust hierarchy as effectively as it preserves useful order. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Even so, the conceptual pattern remains persuasive. When training, records, and office-based authority are already functioning before departure, institutions lose less capability when the founder exits. The limits still matter. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. Some institutions outlasted their founders because they had already turned memory, judgment, and authorization into shared roles and repeatable practice, so departure removed a person without erasing the system's operating knowledge. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. The explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking what the institution remembers without the founder in the room. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. Authority moves through institutions when later office holders inherit more than prestige and receive usable procedure, training, and recognized boundaries. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. Remove the ceremonial surface, and the issue becomes whether successors can act through a role or must constantly imitate a vanished personality. Ask the structural question. This outcome cannot be reduced to one heroic founder or one weak successor. Continuity depends on what had already been distributed before departure. Ask the structural question. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet the clearest sign of durability is often whether ordinary work continues when extraordinary presence is gone. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains whether a founder is building a durable institution or merely training everyone else to wait for the founder's return. That question pushes attention back towards structure. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.